Silent Fury. Sable Thorne arrived at Lincoln High School on a Tuesday morning in late September with nothing but a worn backpack and the weight of a promise she'd made to her grandmother 3 months before the cancer finally took her. The promise was simple but absolute: no more fighting no matter what. Her grandmother had held her hand in that sterile hospital room, machines beeping their steady countdown, and made Sable swear on everything she loved that she'd leave that life behind. The underground circuit in Portland, the bruised knuckles, the adrenaline of stepping into the ring knowing she could break someone twice her size, all of it had to stay buried in Oregon when she moved to her aunt's house in suburban Illinois. Sable had agreed because she'd seen the fear in her grandmother's eyes, the terror that the granddaughter she'd raised would end up dead in some back-alley fight or worse, in prison for putting someone in the hospital. So Sable had walked away from the only thing she'd ever been truly good at, packed her few belongings, and boarded a Greyhound bus heading east toward a fresh start at a school where nobody knew her name or her reputation. Lincoln High sprawled across 6 acres in a town that prided itself on Friday night football and academic achievement in equal measure. The building itself was a mixture of old brick construction from the 1960s and newer additions that tried unsuccessfully to blend with the original architecture. The main hallway stretched nearly 300 feet from the north entrance to the south, lined with rows of blue metal lockers that echoed with every slammed door and shuffling footstep. Sable's locker was number 247, wedged between the chemistry lab and the stairwell that led to the second-floor English classrooms. She kept it sparse. A few textbooks, nothing personal, nothing that would give anyone a window into who she really was or where she'd come from. She'd chosen her appearance carefully to blend into the background. Her dark hair hung straight and unstyled past her shoulders. Her clothes were deliberately unremarkable thrift store finds in muted colors, and she kept her gaze down when she walked through the crowded hallways. At 5'4" and barely 115 pounds, Sable knew she looked like an easy target. She'd lost weight since leaving Portland, stopped her rigorous training routine, let her muscle definition soften into something less noticeable. The other students at Lincoln saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a quiet new girl who didn't make eye contact, who ate lunch alone in the far corner of the cafeteria near the emergency exit, who never raised her hand in class even though she usually knew the answers. What they couldn't see was the way she catalogued every exit in every room, the way her eyes tracked movement with predatory precision before she remembered to soften her gaze, the way her hands would sometimes curl into fists with perfect form before she consciously relaxed them. They didn't notice the controlled precision in the way she moved through crowded spaces, never bumping into anyone, always aware of the positions of the people around her. They didn't see the gym bag she kept in her car, still packed with hand wraps and a mouthguard she'd promised herself she wouldn't need. They had no idea that the skinny new girl who flinched at loud noises had spent the last 4 years training 6 days a week in Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that she'd fought 23 amateur bouts and won 21 of them, that she could end a fight before most people even realized it had started. Her first week passed in careful anonymity. She learned the layout of the school, identified the social hierarchies that governed Lincoln High like unwritten law, and made herself as invisible as possible. The cafeteria was a massive space that could seat 400 students, divided into invisible territories as clearly as any prison yard. The athletes dominated the center tables near the food line. Football players and their girlfriends, basketball team, volleyball players, all clustered together in a mass of letter jackets and confident laughter. The academic elite claimed the tables near the windows. AP students and debate team members engaged in animated discussions about college applications and scholarship deadlines. The theatre and art students congregated near the back wall, a splash of creative chaos with their dramatic gestures and paint-stained clothing. And then there were the undefined spaces, the tables for everyone who didn't quite fit into any category, and the isolated corners where people like Sable ate alone with their backs to the wall and their eyes on the exits. She first noticed Tatum Prescott on Wednesday of that first week. He was impossible to miss, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. His father was a prominent attorney in town, the kind who got his name in the paper and his face on billboards. Tatum wore that privilege like a second skin, moving through the hallways like he owned them, which in many ways he did. He had the kind of looks that made people forgive behavior they shouldn't. Sharp jawline, carefully styled blonde hair, expensive clothes that somehow made the school uniform look designer. He traveled with an entourage, always 2 or 3 other students orbiting around him, laughing at his jokes, agreeing with his observations, doing whatever it took to stay in his good graces. Sable's first direct interaction with Tatum came at the end of her second week, a Friday afternoon when she was walking to the library. She had her head down, focused on getting from point A to point B without incident, when someone's shoulder connected hard with hers. The impact sent her stumbling sideways into a locker with a metallic clang that echoed down the hallway. Her textbooks scattered across the tile floor, papers sliding in different directions. Sable's instinct was to spin, set her stance, prepare for a follow-up attack, but she caught herself, forced her body to remain passive, kept her breathing steady despite the spike of adrenaline. "Watch where you're going," Tatum said, not even looking back as he continued down the hall with his friends. One of them, a tall kid with a buzz cut named Garrison, glanced back and smirked, but they kept walking. Sable knelt slowly and gathered her scattered belongings, aware of the students streaming past, none of them offering to help. A few glanced at her with what might have been sympathy, but sympathy didn't translate into action. She took her time collecting every paper, using the moment to let her heart rate return to normal, reminding herself of the promise she'd made. This was nothing, a minor bump in a crowded hallway, not worth breaking an oath to a woman who'd given her everything. The following Monday, Tatum was at his usual table in the cafeteria when Sable walked past, carrying her tray to her solitary corner. She heard his voice before she saw him turn toward her. "Hey, new girl." His tone was casual, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "You know you're allowed to sit with other people, right? You don't have to hide in the corner like some kind of freak." His friends erupted in laughter that was too loud, too performative, meant to draw attention from surrounding tables. Sable felt the weight of eyes turning toward her, but she kept walking, her face carefully neutral. She set her tray down at her usual table and sat with her back to the wall, pulling out a paperback novel she'd been rereading, using it as a shield against the world. "I'm talking to you," Tatum called out, louder now, enjoying the audience he'd gathered. "It's rude to ignore people." Sable turned a page in her book, though she wasn't processing any of the words. Her peripheral vision tracked Tatum as he stood up from his table, and for a moment she thought he might actually approach her. Her muscles tensed involuntarily, years of training kicking in, preparing her body for what might come. But one of his friends, a stocky kid with acne scars named Ryder, said something she couldn't hear, and Tatum laughed and sat back down. The moment passed, but Sable knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning. She was right. Over the next week, the incidents escalated gradually, each one individually small enough to dismiss but collectively forming a pattern she recognized. Tuesday morning, someone bumped into her in the hallway hard enough to send her coffee splashing down the front of her shirt. Wednesday, she opened her locker to find someone had stuffed crumpled papers inside, making her books and notebooks fall out when she tried to retrieve them. Thursday, she sat down in English class to find someone had written "freak" on her desk in permanent marker. Friday, in the cafeteria, someone's backpack accidentally knocked her lunch tray, sending her food sliding across the table, ranch dressing pooling on her homework. Through it all, Sable remained silent. She changed her coffee-stained shirt in the bathroom without complaint. She picked up the papers from her locker without confronting anyone. She sat at the desk with the slur written on it and took notes around it until a teacher noticed and sent her to a different seat. She salvaged what she could of her lunch and her homework, cleaned up the rest, and continued reading her book. The teachers saw. She knew they saw. Mr. Harrison watched from his classroom door as someone knocked her books out of her hands in the hallway, but turned away when she looked up, disappearing back into his room. Mrs. Chen was in the cafeteria when the backpack incident happened, standing at the teacher's supervision table with a clear view of everything, but she simply frowned and looked away, busying herself with her phone. The message was clear. This was not their problem, and they had no intention of making it their problem. Lincoln High had a reputation to maintain, and that reputation didn't include acknowledging that bullying existed within its carefully maintained walls. By the end of September, Sable had established a routine built around avoidance. She arrived at school exactly 7 minutes before the first bell, giving her just enough time to get to her locker and first class without lingering in the hallways. She'd mapped out 3 different routes between each of her classes, choosing whichever path seemed least populated with Tatum and his group. She ate lunch in 13 minutes, spending the rest of the period in the library, where Tatum and his friends rarely ventured. She kept her head down, her responses minimal, her presence as small as possible. The weekend offered brief respite. Sable lived with her Aunt Diana in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, a quiet woman who worked night shifts at the hospital and slept most of the day. They had an arrangement that worked for both of them. Sable kept to herself, maintained her grades, and didn't cause trouble, and Diana asked no questions about the gym bag that stayed packed in the trunk of Sable's beat-up Honda Civic, or the way bruises from old fights were still fading from her ribs and shoulders. Saturday morning, Sable drove 40 minutes to a gym in the next town over, somewhere nobody from Lincoln High would ever go, and spent 2 hours hitting the heavy bag. She told herself it was just to stay in shape, just to burn off stress, but with every jab and cross and roundhouse kick, she felt the carefully constructed walls of her new identity threatening to crack. Her knuckles ached as she drove home, and she caught herself checking her form in the rearview mirror at a stoplight. Her hands were positioning themselves in perfect guard position without conscious thought. She forced them back to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel and reminded herself why she was doing this. The promise, the fresh start, the chance to be someone other than the girl who'd put 3 grown men in the emergency room when they'd tried to jump her after a fight. The girl whose reputation had gotten so big that promoters started having trouble finding opponents willing to face her. The girl whose grandmother had died, terrified that her granddaughter's talent for violence would lead to prison or death. October arrived with falling leaves and cooling temperatures, and the bullying evolved from individual incidents into sustained campaigns. Monday morning, Sable discovered that someone had gotten into her locker over the weekend. The lock was still intact, which meant someone had access to the school or knew how to pick it. Her textbooks had been rearranged, personal items had been rifled through, and her notebook for English class was missing. She found it later that day in the cafeteria garbage can, pages torn and coffee-stained. Tuesday, someone started a rumor that she'd been kicked out of her last school for starting a fight that sent another student to the hospital. The irony of the rumor being partially true wasn't lost on Sable, but the way other students started giving her an even wider berth, the way teachers looked at her with suspicion, made her feel the walls closing in. Wednesday afternoon, she was in the bathroom between classes when she heard them coming. Multiple footsteps, the distinctive sound of Tatum's voice echoing off the tile. Sable was washing her hands when 3 girls entered, all of them wearing the unofficial uniform of Tatum's inner circle. expensive athleisure wear, perfectly applied makeup, expressions of casual cruelty. The leader was a tall redhead named Sloane, who'd been dating Tatum since sophomore year. "So you're the one," Sloane said, leaning against the counter in a way that blocked the exit. "The little weirdo who's been bothering Tatum." Sable didn't respond, just dried her hands carefully and moved toward the door. One of the other girls, a blonde named McKenna, stepped into her path. "She's talking to you," McKenna said. "Don't be rude." Every instinct Sable had was screaming at her to assess threats, establish dominance, control the space. In Portland, this situation would have lasted about 3 seconds before someone was on the ground. But this wasn't Portland, and she wasn't that person anymore. She took a breath and tried to step around McKenna. Sloane moved faster, grabbing Sable's backpack and yanking it off her shoulder. The sudden jerk made Sable's body react before her mind could stop it. Her hand shot out, fingers wrapping around Sloane's wrist with precision grip, her body weight shifting automatically into a stance that would allow her to redirect force if needed. The movement was pure instinct, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training. For just a moment, Sable saw recognition flash in Sloane's eyes. Not recognition of who Sable was, but recognition that maybe this quiet new girl wasn't quite as helpless as she appeared. Then Sable consciously relaxed her grip and stepped back, letting her backpack fall to the floor. "Keep it," Sable said quietly, her first words to any of them. Her voice was steady, controlled, nothing like the racing of her heart. "I don't want trouble." She left the bathroom without her backpack, walked directly to the main office, and reported it stolen. The secretary seemed surprised by her calm demeanor, took down the information, and promised to look into it. Sable's backpack reappeared in her locker the next day, contents intact, and nothing more was said about it. But the message had been sent and received. She wouldn't fight back, which meant she was fair game for whatever they wanted to do. The shoulder bumps in the hallway increased in frequency and force. Sable found herself stumbling into lockers multiple times a day, her books getting knocked from her hands so often she started carrying fewer of them. Someone started timing their walk past her in the cafeteria to accidentally kick her chair, making her jolt forward. In chemistry lab, her assigned partner suddenly requested a transfer, forcing her to work alone while other students worked in pairs. The isolation was methodical, calculated, designed to make her feel like she didn't exist except as a target. She held on to the promise, but it was getting harder. Every time someone shoved her, her body wanted to respond with an elbow strike. Every time someone spoke to her with contempt, she had to physically bite her tongue to keep from responding. At night, alone in her room, she'd practice forms in silence, moving through combinations with perfect precision, feeling the power in her body that she couldn't use, the skill she couldn't reveal. The first time she saw Knox was in the library on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. She'd claimed her usual spot at a table in the back corner, hidden behind the stacks, where she could work on homework in relative peace. She heard him before she saw him, a polite argument with the librarian about checking out more than the standard limit of books. His voice was patient, but persistent, explaining something about a research project that required extensive sources, and eventually Mrs. Rodriguez relented with a sigh and an instruction to return them all within 2 weeks. He appeared around the corner of the stacks carrying an armload of books that threatened to topple at any moment, and stopped short when he saw Sable at what was apparently his usual table. "Oh," he said, then smiled with genuine warmth. "Sorry, I usually sit here, but I can find another spot." Sable looked up at him fully for the first time. He was tall and lean, with dark curly hair that looked like it had never met a comb it respected, olive skin, and brown eyes that held actual kindness rather than the performative sympathy she'd gotten used to. He wore a vintage band t-shirt under an open flannel and jeans with actual holes worn through from use, rather than purchase that way. "It's fine," Sable said quietly. "There's room." Knox considered this for a moment, then carefully set his stack of books on the opposite end of the table and sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. For about 20 minutes, they worked in comfortable silence. Sable found herself relaxing incrementally, the constant tension in her shoulders easing slightly. There was something peaceful about sharing space with someone who didn't want anything from her, who didn't look at her like she was either prey or entertainment. "You're in my calculus class," Knox said eventually, keeping his voice library appropriate. "You sit in the back by the windows." Sable nodded, not sure what to say. She did sit there, specifically because it gave her a clear view of the door and all the exits. "You know way more than you let on," Knox continued, flipping through one of his books. "Yesterday, when Morrison asked about derivatives, you had the answer before anyone else. I saw your face, but you didn't raise your hand." "I don't like attention," Sable said, which was true but incomplete. "Yeah, I get that." Knox made a note in his notebook, some kind of complicated equation that meant nothing to Sable. "Though around here, trying to be invisible sometimes makes you more of a target." Sable's hand tightened on her pencil. "What do you mean?" Knox glanced up, and there was something in his expression that told her he'd seen more than she'd hoped. "Tatum Prescott. I've seen the way he and his friends treat you. The shoulder bumps, the comments, all of it." He paused, then added carefully, "I've seen the way you don't react. That takes a lot of control." Something in Sable's chest constricted. Having someone actually acknowledge what was happening, having someone see her, made the whole situation suddenly more real and harder to bear. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Knox shrugged. "Because pretending not to see things makes me complicit, and because I thought maybe you could use a friend who actually gives a damn." The simplicity of the offer stunned her into silence. A friend. The word felt foreign, something from another life. In Portland, she'd had training partners, sparring buddies, people who respected her in the ring, but none of them had really known her. Her grandmother had been her only real friend, the only person who'd seen all of her and loved her anyway. "You don't know me," Sable finally said. "No," Knox agreed, "but I'd like to. If that's okay." And just like that, with no fanfare or dramatic declaration, Sable found herself nodding. They exchanged numbers. Knox returned to his reading, and Sable went back to her homework with the strange feeling that something significant had just shifted in her carefully constructed, solitary existence. Over the next 2 weeks, Knox became a steady presence in her life in small, undramatic ways. They sat together in the library most afternoons, working on homework, with occasional conversations about everything and nothing. Music, books, the absurdity of standardized testing, their theories about what the cafeteria claimed was chicken. Knox was easy to talk to, never pushing for information she wasn't ready to give, never making her feel like she had to perform or pretend. He had his own story of being a misfit at Lincoln, too smart for the popular crowd, too irreverent for the academic elite, more interested in reading philosophy and playing guitar than in fitting into any prescribed social category. He told her about his family, how his dad was a mechanic who could fix any engine, but struggled to fix his relationship with Knox's mother after the divorce, how his 2 younger sisters treated him like a combination of jungle gym and personal chauffeur. He talked about his plans to study environmental science in college, maybe work for a conservation organization, do something meaningful instead of just chasing money. When he asked about her background, Sable gave him the carefully edited version, moved from Portland after her grandmother died, living with her aunt, trying to finish school and figure out what came next. She didn't mention the fighting, the underground circuits, the way her hands knew how to break bones with surgical precision. Knox seemed to accept her answers without pressing for more, but she could tell he sensed there was more to the story. He'd watch her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, a considering look in his eyes like he was trying to solve a puzzle. But he never pushed, never demanded access to parts of her she wasn't ready to share, and that restraint made her trust him more than any amount of interrogation could have. The third week of October, Knox started meeting her at her locker in the mornings. It wasn't planned or discussed. He just started being there when she arrived, leaning against the locker next to hers, with his perpetually overloaded backpack and a genuine smile. They'd talk for a few minutes before first period. Nothing important. Just easy conversation that made the start of her day feel less oppressive. Other students started to notice, started to categorize them as friends, which meant Knox began receiving some of the peripheral harassment that had been focused solely on Sable. She noticed when someone shoulder-checked him in the hallway. She saw when his books got knocked out of his hands by accident. She heard Tatum's friends making comments about Knox slumming with the freak girl, loud enough to ensure they'd both hear. Knox handled it with an easy indifference that Sable couldn't help but admire, making self-deprecating jokes or simply ignoring the provocations entirely. But she could see the moments where his jaw would tighten, where his eyes would flash with annoyance before he consciously let it go. "You don't have to be seen with me," Sable told him one afternoon in the library. "I know it's making things harder for you." Knox looked up from his calculus homework with an expression of genuine confusion. "Why would I care about that?" "Because Tatum and his friends are assholes," Knox finished, "which is their problem, not mine. You think I'm going to let some overgrown children dictate who I spend time with?" He shook his head. "Not happening. Besides, you're the most interesting person in this entire school. Everyone else is so busy trying to fit in or stand out in all the approved ways. You're just yourself, even when it would be easier not to be." Sable felt something warm and uncomfortable in her chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You don't really know who I am." "Not all of it," Knox agreed, "but I know enough. I know you're ridiculously smart, but hide it. I know you read William Blake for fun, which is both impressive and slightly concerning. I know you're dealing with something difficult and refusing to let it break you. That's enough for now. The rest you'll tell me when you're ready." The assumption that there would be a "when you're ready" rather than an "if" made Sable's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She looked back down at her chemistry homework before he could see the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Their friendship deepened through small shared moments. Knox introduced her to his favorite coffee shop off campus, a tiny place run by an elderly couple that made the best mochas Sable had ever tasted. They started having what Knox called Deep Thoughts Thursday, where they'd debate philosophy or ethics or whatever else crossed their minds. He played her songs on his guitar, acoustic versions of rock classics with his own improvisational flourishes. She found herself laughing more, genuine laughter that felt strange after months of carefully controlled neutrality. Knox had a way of making her feel seen without making her feel exposed. He noticed things, the way she always positioned herself with her back to a wall, the way her eyes tracked movement in crowded spaces, the controlled precision in the way she moved, but he didn't comment on them, just filed them away as pieces of the puzzle he was willing to wait to solve. The first Friday in November, Knox invited her to come watch his band practice in his friend's garage. Sable hesitated, unused to social invitations, unsure if she wanted to expand her social circle beyond this one person who'd somehow slipped past her defenses. But Knox's hopeful expression broke through her resistance, and she found herself agreeing. The practice was loud, chaotic, and genuinely fun, in a way Sable hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Knox played bass alongside a drummer named Theo and a guitarist named Jasmine, and they were actually good, playing a mix of alternative rock and their own compositions. Between songs, they joked and argued about chord progressions and welcomed Sable with easy warmth that made her feel like maybe, possibly, she could have a life here that wasn't just about surviving day to day. Afterward, they all went to the coffee shop, and Sable found herself part of a conversation about music theory and concert venues, and the impossible logistics of being a teenager trying to make art in suburban Illinois. For a few hours, she wasn't the quiet new girl or Tatum's target. She was just Sable, sitting with people who treated her like she belonged. Knox drove her home that night, his beat-up Subaru making concerning rattling noises that he insisted were character. They sat in her driveway for 20 minutes, talking about everything and nothing. And when Sable finally got out of the car, she realized she was smiling. Really smiling, the kind that reached her eyes and made her face ache. That weekend, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Sable let herself acknowledge what was happening. She was developing feelings for Knox that went beyond friendship, an attraction that was as much about his mind and his kindness as it was about the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed or the way his hands moved when he played music. It was dangerous and complicated, and she tried to convince herself to shut it down before it could become something more. But every time she thought about putting distance between them, she remembered his smile, his easy acceptance, the way he made her feel like maybe she deserved to have good things in her life. Monday morning, Knox was waiting at her locker as usual, but when she approached, she immediately sensed something was different. His posture was tense, his expression carefully controlled, and there was a smudge of what looked like paint on his shirt. "What happened?" Sable asked, already knowing it was bad. Knox showed her his phone. Someone had created a fake social media account in his name and posted a series of increasingly vulgar and offensive statements, tagging half the school in the process. The posts claimed Knox was in love with Sable, described her in crude sexual terms that made Sable's stomach turn, and included photoshopped images of them together in compromising positions that were obviously fake, but damaging regardless. "It's Tatum," Knox said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "It has to be." "I know it's him." Sable felt ice spreading through her veins. This was her fault. By becoming her friend, Knox had painted a target on his own back, and now he was paying the price for her presence in his life. "I'm reporting it," Knox continued. "I'm going to the principal right now, showing them everything. This crosses every line." "It won't matter," Sable said quietly, knowing it was true. "His dad's on the school board. He donates to the athletic department. They'll investigate, make sympathetic noises, and nothing will change." Knox's expression hardened. "Then what do you suggest? We just accept this?" "No," Sable said, though she wasn't sure what the alternative was. "But you need to be prepared for nothing to come of it." She was right. Knox reported the account to the administration, provided screenshots, identified multiple witnesses who'd seen the posts. Principal Anderson listened with appropriate concern, promised a thorough investigation, and 2 days later announced that they couldn't definitively prove who'd created the account and therefore couldn't take disciplinary action. The posts were removed, the fake account deleted, but the damage was done. Half the school had seen those images, those claims, and while some people defended Knox and Sable, many more found it amusing or worse, believed there might be truth to the crude accusations. The hallway comments increased. People would make kissing noises when Sable and Knox walked past. Someone wrote explicit graffiti about them in the second-floor bathroom. Sable's locker was vandalized again, this time with printed pictures from the fake account taped to the door. Knox received anonymous texts with threats and accusations. Through it all, Tatum maintained plausible deniability, his polished smile never slipping, his hands apparently clean of any wrongdoing. The week after the fake account incident, Sable noticed Sloane and her friends watching her with increased hostility. On Wednesday afternoon, Sable went to the bathroom and found the three of them already there, clearly waiting. This time there was no pretense of coincidence. "You need to understand something," Sloane said, blocking the exit just like before. "Knox deserves better than some weird little freak who can't even stand up for herself. Whatever you think is happening between you two, it's not. He's just being nice because he feels sorry for you." The words were designed to wound, and they partially succeeded, hitting the insecurities Sable had been trying to ignore. But there was also something else in Sloane's voice. Jealousy, maybe, or genuine concern for Knox twisted into cruelty. "Knox makes his own choices," Sable said, keeping her voice even. "That's between him and me." "There is no him and you," McKenna interjected. "You're a nobody. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it. Why don't you do everyone a favor and transfer somewhere else?" Sable felt her control slipping, felt the rage she'd been suppressing for weeks threatening to surface. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, proper form without conscious thought. She took a breath, forced herself to relax. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. The third girl, a brunette named Ainsley who'd been silent until now, suddenly threw her cup of soda directly at Sable's face. The cold liquid splashed across her nose and mouth, dripping down her chin and soaking into her shirt. Sable stood absolutely still, blinking soda out of her eyes, her body screaming at her to respond, to move, to fight. But she could hear her grandmother's voice, could feel that hospital room promise binding her like chains. Sloane laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the tiles. "Look at her. Won't even defend herself. What a joke." They left her standing there, dripping and humiliated, and Sable spent the next 10 minutes cleaning herself up in the sink. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, soaked hair, stained shirt, jaw clenched so tight it ached, and barely recognized herself. The girl in Portland would never have allowed this. The girl in Portland would have had all three of them on the floor before that cup left Ainsley's hand. But that girl had made a promise, and promises to the dead were supposed to mean something. Knox found her in the library afterward, took one look at her, and didn't ask questions, just sat down beside her and quietly shared his lunch since she'd lost her appetite. His simple presence, his refusal to treat her like she was broken, helped more than words could have. That night, Knox texted her, "You don't have to tell me. But I know there's more to you than what you show. And whatever it is, I'm here when you're ready." Sable stared at the message for a long time before responding, "Thank you." The pressure continued building through mid-November. Tatum seemed to view the entire school as his personal kingdom, and Sable's refusal to either fight back or flee clearly offended him on some fundamental level. The bullying became more creative, more public, designed not just to hurt her but to humiliate her in front of as many witnesses as possible. Someone put a dead mouse in her locker. Someone else spread a rumor that she'd been arrested for assault at her previous school, a rumor that was close enough to the truth to be uncomfortable but distorted enough to make her sound dangerous and unstable. Her tires were deflated in the school parking lot 3 times in 2 weeks. Someone created a fan page for her on social media that posted embarrassing photos and cruel commentary daily, gaining hundreds of followers before it was finally removed. Through it all, Knox stayed beside her, his loyalty absolute even as the harassment extended to him. His car was keyed. Someone started a rumor that he'd been expelled from his previous school for stalking an ex-girlfriend. His band's practice space was vandalized, equipment damaged. But every morning he was still at her locker with a smile and a coffee and an absolutely refusal to let Tatum Prescott dictate his life. Their relationship evolved during those difficult weeks, moving from friendship into something more significant without either of them explicitly naming it. Knox would take her hand when they walked between classes, a simple gesture of solidarity that felt monumental. They'd sit closer in the library, shoulders touching as they worked. The conversations deepened, moving beyond surface topics into hopes and fears and dreams for futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. One Friday night in late November, Knox took Sable to watch the sunset from an overlook outside of town, a spot where you could see for miles across rolling Illinois farmland. They sat on the hood of his car, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple, and Knox finally asked the question he'd been holding back for weeks. "Sable," he said carefully, "I know you're hiding something. I don't need to know what, but I need to know. Are you in some kind of danger? Is there something I should be worried about?" Sable considered her answer carefully. "Not the kind you're thinking. I'm not running from anyone or in trouble with the law. I made a promise to someone important that I'm trying very hard to keep, and keeping that promise means not being the person I used to be." Knox absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Okay, but you know that if you need help, or if things get bad enough that you can't keep that promise, I'm here, whatever you need." "I know," Sable said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Knox had become essential to her in ways she hadn't anticipated, an anchor keeping her tethered to this new identity she was trying to build. The thought of losing him, of his disappointment if he ever saw what she was really capable of, terrified her more than Tatum's entire campaign of harassment. Knox leaned over and kissed her then, gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand. Sable kissed him back, tasting his coffee-flavored breath and feeling something in her chest crack open. For a moment, sitting there with the sunset painting the sky and Knox's hand warm against her cheek, she let herself believe that maybe she could have this, a normal life, a normal relationship, a future that didn't involve violence and adrenaline and the roar of underground crowds chanting for blood. The following Monday shattered that illusion. Sable arrived at school to find everyone staring at their phones, conversations stopping when she walked past. Knox met her at her locker, his face pale, and wordlessly showed her his screen. Someone had found footage from Portland, not just any footage, but video from one of her last fights, the brutal bout where she'd broken her opponent's nose and jaw in the second round, the fight that had made her grandmother beg her to stop before she killed someone or got killed herself. The video was edited to make her look as violent as possible, cutting out context and showing only the most brutal moments. Sable's face twisted with aggression she barely remembered feeling, her fists and elbows landing with sickening force, her opponent crumpling to the mat while Sable stood over them like some kind of monster. Underneath the video, someone had written, "This is who Sable Thorne really is. A violent psychopath pretending to be normal. Watch out." The video had been shared hundreds of times overnight. Every student at Lincoln High had seen it, every teacher, the administration. Everyone now knew that quiet, passive Sable had a history of violence, that she'd fought in underground circuits, that she was capable of serious harm. Sable felt her carefully constructed world imploding. She looked at Knox, trying to gauge his reaction, terrified of what she might see in his eyes. "I can explain," she started, but Knox was already shaking his head. "You don't have to," he said firmly. "I don't care. Whatever this is, whatever you did, I know you. The person in that video isn't the same person standing here right now. But no buts. I trust you, Sable. Whatever reasons you had for fighting, for hiding it, they're yours. You don't owe me explanations." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I have to say you're incredibly impressive." Those moves were legitimate. The casual acceptance stunned her. She'd been so certain that revealing her past would drive everyone away, but Knox just squeezed her hand and walked with her into the building like nothing had changed. The other students were less understanding. People who'd previously just ignored her now looked at her with fear or fascination, or both. The harassment stopped for a brief period as everyone recalibrated their understanding of who Sable was. Tatum and his group kept their distance for a few days, clearly reassessing their approach. But fear and fascination eventually curdled into resentment. If Sable could fight like that, why hadn't she fought back against them? The passivity that had made her a safe target now seemed like mockery, like she'd been playing with them, making them look foolish. The narrative shifted. Sable wasn't a victim. She was a threat pretending to be weak, which was somehow worse. The bullying returned with renewed intensity, but now it was tinged with an edge of dangerous escalation. Tatum and his friends seemed determined to provoke her into revealing the violence they'd seen in the video. They wanted proof that she was the monster the footage suggested, wanted to justify their treatment of her by forcing her to become the aggressor. The shoulder bumps became harder, more deliberate. The verbal comments became more aggressive, more directly confrontational. Someone slashed her tires again, but this time they left a note. "We know what you are." Someone else broke into her car and destroyed the interior, tearing up seats and smashing her dashboard. The gym bag with her training equipment that she'd kept in the trunk was stolen, her hand wraps and mouthguard taken as trophies or proof. Through it all, Sable maintained her control by a thread that grew thinner every day. Her promise to her grandmother was the only thing keeping her from responding. But she could feel it wearing away, eroded by relentless pressure. At night, she'd lie awake, imagining all the ways she could end this, all the techniques she could use to put Tatum on the ground and make sure he stayed there. The fantasies were vivid and violent and made her hate herself for having them. Knox became her lifeline, the one person who didn't treat her differently after the video. He'd hold her hand in the hallways, walk her to class, sit with her at lunch, despite the whispers and stares. His band dedicated a song to her at a local venue, a defiant middle finger to anyone who thought they could break her spirit. Jasmine and Theo became friendly as well, expanding her social circle to a small group of people who saw her as a person rather than a spectacle or a threat. But even Knox's support couldn't protect her from what came next. The incident happened on a Wednesday in early December, during the peak lunch period when the cafeteria was packed with nearly 400 students. Sable was sitting at her usual table with Knox, Jasmine and Theo, trying to eat her lunch and ignore the stares and whispers that had become constant background noise. The air was thick with conversation and the smell of institutional food. Today's offering was tacos, or at least Lincoln High's interpretation of tacos, featuring mystery meat and suspiciously orange cheese. Sable was mid-bite of her pathetic taco when she felt eyes on her. She looked up to see Tatum approaching her table, flanked by Garrison, Ryder, and 2 other members of his inner circle. They were carrying lunch trays, which was unusual. Tatum's group typically bought food, but ate outside or in Tatum's truck, too cool to sit in the regular cafeteria. "Sable," Tatum said, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby tables. "We need to talk." Knox's hand tightened on his fork. "Walk away, Tatum." "I'm not talking to you," Tatum said without looking at Knox. His eyes were fixed on Sable with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of every person in the room, every exit, every potential threat. "I'm talking to our school's resident cage fighter. See, I've been thinking about that video. Pretty impressive moves. Makes me wonder why you've been playing the victim all this time when you could clearly handle yourself." Sable set down her taco carefully, wiping her hands on a napkin with deliberate slowness. "I don't want to fight anyone, Tatum. I've never wanted to fight anyone here." "That's not what it looks like on video," Ryder interjected. "Look to me like you enjoy hurting people." The unfairness of it made Sable's jaw clench. That was a sanctioned bout, consent, rules, referees, not the same thing as attacking someone in a school hallway. "Sounds like excuses," Garrison said. "Sounds like maybe you're not as tough as you want everyone to think." Sable could feel Knox beside her tensing, preparing to stand up and intervene. She put a hand on his arm, a silent request to let her handle this. The entire cafeteria had gone quiet now, conversations dying out as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. "What do you want, Tatum?" Sable asked, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. Tatum smiled, and there was something in his expression that made Sable's instincts scream danger. "I want to see if you're really as tough as that video makes you look. See, my friends and I, we've been taking bets. I say you're all hype, that anyone could look good in an edited video, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove me wrong." He picked up a cup from his tray, one of those large cafeteria cups filled with what looked like fruit punch. But as he lifted it, Sable caught a whiff of something that made her eyes water. The liquid was normal punch color, but there was an unmistakable acrid smell cutting through the sweetness. Hot sauce. A lot of it. "Here's the thing," Tatum continued, his voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "We're all tired of you playing the victim when we know you're not. So either you drink this and prove you're not just talk, or you can get up and leave Lincoln High for good. Your choice." He held the cup out toward her, and Sable could see that it was filled nearly to the brim with liquid that was definitely more hot sauce than punch. Probably the industrial-strength stuff from the condiment station, mixed with whatever additional heat Tatum and his friends had brought from home. The challenge was absurd, childish, and designed for maximum humiliation. If she drank it, she'd be in agony, probably vomiting, definitely making a scene. If she refused, she'd look weak, and the harassment would only escalate. Either way, Tatum won. Sable looked at the cup, then at Tatum's smug face, then at the hundreds of students watching with their phones out, ready to record whatever happened next. She felt Knox's hand on her arm, his silent solidarity, and made her decision. "No," she said simply. Tatum's smile widened. "No?" "That's it. Just no." "Just no," Sable confirmed. "I'm not drinking that, and I'm not leaving school. You don't get to dictate my choices." For a moment Tatum's expression flickered with something like respect, but it passed quickly, replaced by anger at being defied in front of his audience. "Then I guess we'll have to help you make the right choice." It happened fast. Garrison and Ryder moved simultaneously, grabbing for Sable's arms while Tatum stepped forward with the cup. Their plan was obvious. Hold her still while Tatum poured the burning liquid down her throat, the ultimate humiliation captured on dozens of phones for eternal social media infamy. What happened next took approximately 3 seconds, but would replay in slow motion in dozens of videos uploaded to every social media platform. Garrison's hand reached for Sable's left arm. Years of muscle memory kicked in before conscious thought. Sable's body moved with the fluid precision of thousands of hours of training, her left arm sweeping up and around in a perfect parry that redirected Garrison's grab, her weight shifting to her right foot as she simultaneously caught Ryder's incoming right hand with her own right hand, controlling his wrist with grip strength that made him gasp in surprise. Tatum was already in motion with the cup, committed to the throw, unable to stop his momentum. Sable's left hand shot out and grabbed the cup from his hand with perfect timing, her fingers wrapping around it securely. In one continuous motion, she pushed up from her seat, her core engaging with the explosive power that had won her fights against opponents twice her size. The entire cafeteria seemed to freeze as Sable stood there holding the cup, Garrison and Ryder both controlled by her grip on their arms, Tatum's hand empty and his expression shocked. For one crystalline moment, Sable could have done anything. She could have dumped the cup on Tatum's head. She could have released the boy's arms and used her free hand to show them exactly what those fight videos had demonstrated. She could have made them hurt the way they'd been making her hurt for months. Instead, Sable looked at Tatum directly, her voice calm and clear, and said, "You really should be more careful with your drink." Then she flipped the cup forward with a controlled flick of her wrist, Not a wild throw, but a precise distribution of liquid that covered Tatum's face, shirt, and jacket in what had to be agonizing spray of concentrated hot sauce and punch. Some splashed back onto Garrison and Ryder, both of whom were still held in place by Sable's grip, unable to dodge. The reactions were instantaneous and visceral. Tatum screamed, his hands flying to his eyes as the hot sauce burned. Garrison jerked backward so hard he broke Sable's grip and stumbled into another table. Ryder fell to his knees, his own hands covering his face as he let out a string of profanities. The smell of hot sauce filled the air, making nearby students gasp and back away. Sable released Ryder's arm and stepped back from the chaos she'd created with that single controlled motion. Her hands were steady, her breathing was calm, and for the first time in months she felt the person she used to be and the person she was trying to become, align into something new. The cafeteria erupted. Students were shouting, some laughing, others recording frantically. Teachers and lunch monitors came running from their positions around the room. Tatum was bent over, still screaming, someone pouring water over his face. Garrison had found a napkin dispenser and was frantically wiping at his sauce-splattered shirt. Ryder was being helped to his feet by friends, his face red and streaming with tears. Sable stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, her expression neutral, while Knox and her friends gaped at her with expressions of shock and admiration. Principal Anderson arrived within minutes, pushing through the crowd of students. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. A dozen students started talking at once, but it was Knox who spoke clearly. Tatum Prescott tried to force Sable to drink a cup of hot sauce. When she refused, he and his friends tried to physically restrain her and force it down her throat. She defended herself. "That's assault," Jasmine added loudly. "Multiple witnesses, multiple videos, and it's all on them." Principal Anderson looked around at the phones still recording, at Tatum and his friends suffering from their own attempted prank, at Sable standing calmly with her hands at her sides. His expression suggested he'd finally grasped that this situation was too public, too well documented, to sweep under the rug the way he'd handled previous incidents. "Sable, Knox, my office, now," he said. Then, to Tatum and his friends, "You three to the nurse, then to my office afterward." The walk to the principal's office was surreal. Students parted in front of Sable like Moses parting the Red Sea, their expressions ranging from awe to fear to something like respect. She could hear the whispers starting already, the story spreading and mutating as it passed from person to person. By the time they reached the main office, the narrative had already evolved in a dozen different directions. Principal Anderson's office was a sterile space with motivational posters about achievement and framed photos of successful Lincoln High alumni. He gestured for Sable and Knox to sit while he remained standing behind his desk, clearly trying to maintain authority in a situation that had already slipped beyond his control. "Miss Thorne," he began, his voice heavy with forced patience, "this is exactly the kind of behavior I was afraid of when that video from your previous school surfaced. Violence is never the answer." "I didn't initiate violence," Sable interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Tatum Prescott and his friends have been harassing me for months. Today, they attempted to physically assault me by forcing me to consume something against my will. I defended myself using minimal necessary force. The only people injured were injured by their own prank backfiring." "Backfiring?" Anderson's eyebrows rose. "You deliberately threw—" "I redirected," Sable corrected. "There's a difference. And given that there are probably 50 videos of the entire incident from multiple angles, all showing that Tatum and his friends initiated the confrontation, attempted physical restraint, and were undone by their own materials, I don't think you want to make this about my response." Knox added quietly, "She could have hurt them badly." All three of them. Anyone who saw that video from Portland knows she could have put them all on the ground in seconds. Instead, she just flipped hot sauce on them. If anything, she showed remarkable restraint. Principal Anderson sat down heavily in his chair, and Sable could see him running through calculations. The lawsuit exposure, the negative publicity, the undeniable video evidence, Tatum's father, who would no doubt call screaming within the hour. For the first time, Sable saw what might be genuine concern in his expression, not for the student's well-being, but for the school's liability and his own job security. "I'll need to review the footage," he finally said, "and speak with all parties involved. In the meantime, you're both dismissed to class. I'll call you back if I have further questions." It was essentially an admission that he couldn't discipline Sable without exposing the school's failure to address months of harassment. She and Knox stood to leave, but Sable paused at the door. "Principal Anderson," she said, turning back. "For the record, I've reported incidents to teachers and staff multiple times over the past 2 months. Vandalism, theft, threats, physical intimidation. Nothing was done. Today was inevitable, because the adults in this building chose to look the other way rather than address a problem when it was still manageable." She didn't wait for a response, just walked out with Knox beside her, feeling lighter than she had in months, despite the certain knowledge that this situation was far from over. The remainder of the school day was bizarre. Sable became the center of attention in a way that was entirely different from the previous negative scrutiny. Students she'd never spoken to approached her in hallways to say they'd thought what she did was badass. Someone had created a GIF of the hot sauce flip that was already going viral beyond just Lincoln High. Multiple students apologized for not standing up for her sooner, admitting they'd been afraid to get involved. More significantly, other students began sharing their own stories of harassment by Tatum and his group, creating a sudden avalanche of accusations that the administration could no longer ignore. 3 other students filed formal complaints that afternoon. A sophomore girl reported that Tatum had been sexually harassing her for weeks. A freshman boy said Garrison had been stealing his lunch money and threatening him if he told anyone. The wall of silence that had protected Tatum's behavior for years crumbled in a matter of hours. Sloane and her friends avoided Sable completely, their previous confidence shattered by the realization that their target wasn't helpless after all. The social hierarchy of Lincoln High shifted visibly, power dynamics recalculating in real time as it became clear that Tatum's reign was ending. Knox walked Sable to her car at the end of the day, his hand warm in hers. "That was the most controlled display of badassery I've ever witnessed," he said with admiration. "The way you moved, the precision, it was like watching a master class in restraint." "I almost didn't stop there," Sable admitted quietly. "For a second, I wanted to show them everything I could do, make them understand what a mistake they'd made. But you didn't," Knox pointed out. "You could have hurt them badly and claimed self-defense. Instead, you used their own prank against them and walked away. That's strength, Sable. Real strength." They sat in her car for a while, processing the day, and Sable felt something fundamental shifting inside her. She'd spent months trying to suppress who she was, trying to become someone her grandmother could be proud of, by eliminating the parts of herself that her grandmother had feared. But maybe her grandmother hadn't been afraid of Sable's strength. Maybe she'd been afraid Sable would use that strength to destroy herself and others in pursuit of something meaningless. Today, Sable had used her strength without losing herself. She'd defended herself without becoming the aggressor. She'd shown mercy while maintaining boundaries. Maybe that was what her grandmother had really wanted. Not for Sable to become weak, but for her to become wise enough to know when strength was necessary and when mercy was stronger. The fallout from the cafeteria incident continued over the following days. Principal Anderson conducted his thorough investigation, which mostly consisted of watching the overwhelming video evidence and interviewing witnesses who all confirmed the same narrative. By Friday, the decision came down. Tatum, Garrison and Ryder were suspended for 2 weeks pending a disciplinary hearing that would determine if they'd be expelled. Multiple teachers were formally reprimanded for failing to report harassment. The school sent out a letter to all parents about their renewed commitment to anti-bullying policies and student safety. Tatum's father did threaten lawsuits, did try to use his position and influence to protect his son. But the sheer volume of evidence, the multiple complaints from other students, and the viral nature of the videos made it impossible to sweep away. The school board backed Principal Anderson's decision to avoid worse liability down the line. For Sable, the experience of walking through Lincoln High after the suspension was revelatory. Students greeted her in hallways. Teachers actually smiled at her. She could eat lunch without constant vigilance, could work in the library without looking over her shoulder every 30 seconds. The atmosphere of fear that had defined her experience at Lincoln gradually dissipated, replaced by something that resembled normalcy. Her relationship with Knox deepened through shared trauma and triumph. They had their first official date that Saturday, driving to Chicago to see a concert at a small venue, holding hands on the train and sharing meals at restaurants that felt like adventures. Knox met her Aunt Diana officially, charmed her with his easy manner and genuine care for Sable. Sable met Knox's father and sisters, spending a Sunday afternoon helping his dad rebuild an engine, while his sisters interrogated her about her intentions with their brother. The disciplinary hearing happened 2 weeks later. Sable had to attend as a witness, facing Tatum and his parents across a conference table in the district office. Tatum's lawyer tried to paint Sable as the aggressor, bringing up her fighting history, suggesting she'd been planning to attack his client all along. But the video evidence was damning. Dozens of angles, all showing the same story, all proving that Sable had been defending herself against an initiated assault. More importantly, other students testified. The sophomore girl who'd been sexually harassed, the freshman who'd been extorted, a junior who described being deliberately injured during gym class as part of Tatum's fun. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. Tatum was expelled. Garrison and Ryder received long-term suspensions and mandatory counseling. Their parents were required to pay for damages and restitution to multiple victims. The social media accounts were traced back to Ryder's older brother, resulting in additional legal consequences. Sable expected to feel satisfaction, vindication, triumph. Instead, she mostly felt exhaustion and a strange sense of loss for the person she might have been if none of this had happened. If her grandmother hadn't died, if she'd never had to make that promise or break it partially or figure out how to be strong without being destructive. On a cold afternoon in January, Sable was leaving school when she found Tatum waiting by her car. He'd been allowed to come collect his things from his locker, escorted by security, and he'd apparently managed to slip away long enough to find her. Knox was at band practice, so Sable was alone, which made her immediately wary. But Tatum didn't look threatening. He looked diminished, his confident posture gone, his expensive clothes replaced with a plain hoodie and jeans. The arrogance that had defined him was completely absent. "I'm not here to start anything," he said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I wanted to apologize, really apologize, not because my lawyer told me to, but because I need to say it." Sable kept her distance, her car between them. "Okay, I'm listening." Tatum took a breath. "I spent the last month in therapy, talking through why I did what I did. And the thing is, I don't have a good reason. My therapist keeps asking me to identify what I was getting out of hurting you and other people, and the honest answer is just power, I guess. Control. My dad expects me to be perfect, to be the best at everything, to never show weakness. So I made other people weak to prove I wasn't." He paused, looking down at his shoes. "I saw you quiet and alone, and I thought you were an easy target. Then when you didn't fight back, it made me angrier because it felt like you were making me look bad by not responding. And then when that video came out and I realized you could have destroyed me at any point but chose not to, it made me furious because it proved I was wrong about everything. You weren't weak. I was. Sable didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle. There was genuine remorse in his voice, but also the kind of self-awareness that only came from forced reflection. He might be sorry now, but would he be sorry if he hadn't been caught? If his actions hadn't had consequences? "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. "Because I destroyed your life here for no reason. Because you showed me mercy when you could have made me a cautionary tale. Because I need you to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable, even though I'm asking for forgiveness anyway." Sable considered him carefully. The boy standing before her was not the same person who'd swaggered through Lincoln High like he owned it. Consequence had broken something in him, maybe something that needed to be broken. "I don't forgive you," she said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did to me, to Knox, to all those other students, that caused real harm. Apologies don't undo trauma." Tatum nodded, accepting this. "I understand." "But," Sable continued, "I believe people can change if they actually want to. If you use this as a wake-up call to become someone better, someone who doesn't need to hurt people to feel powerful, then maybe this wasn't entirely wasted. That's on you, though. Not on me to make you feel better about what you did." "I know," Tatum said quietly. "For what it's worth, you were right about everything. The school did protect me because of who my father is. Teachers did see and did nothing. And you had every right to fight back a lot harder than you did. The fact that you didn't says more about your character than anything I could say." He turned to leave, then paused. "I'm transferring to a private school next semester. You won't have to see me again. I hope you and Knox are happy. I hope I didn't ruin everything for you here." Sable watched him walk away, escorted back to security, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger that still wasn't entirely gone. Sadness for the time and energy wasted on this conflict. Relief that it was truly over. And a strange, small hope that maybe Tatum actually would use this experience to become better, to break whatever cycle of toxicity his family had created. The rest of January passed in a way that felt almost mundane after months of constant stress. Sable's grades, which had suffered during the worst of the harassment, began to recover. She joined Knox's friend group more fully, attending their band practices and game nights and long philosophical discussions about everything from climate change to whether I would ever truly be sentient. She started volunteering at a youth center in a neighboring town, teaching basic self-defense to teenagers who'd experienced bullying or abuse, finding a way to use her skills that felt meaningful and constructive. One February afternoon, Sable and Knox were studying in the library when a younger student approached their table hesitantly. She was a freshman, small and nervous, and Sable recognized the look in her eyes. The hypervigilance, the fear, the isolation of someone actively being targeted. Excuse me," the girl said quietly. "You're Sable Thorne, right? The one who, with the hot sauce?" Sable nodded, setting down her textbook. "That's me. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something." "In private?" They moved to a quieter corner of the library, and the girl, her name was Morgan, explained that she was being harassed by a group of other freshmen, constant comments about her weight and her clothes and her interests. Not physical yet, but escalating, and she was terrified it would get worse. Her parents didn't understand. The teachers told her to ignore it. She felt completely alone. Sable listened to the entire story, recognizing every element from her own experience, feeling anger on this girl's behalf, and determination that Morgan wouldn't have to suffer the way Sable had. "Here's what we're going to do," Sable said firmly. First, you're going to write down every incident with dates and times. Second, I'm going to teach you some basic techniques for setting boundaries and maintaining your space. Third, we're going to report this together to the administration, and I'm going to make sure they actually do something this time. And fourth, you're going to sit with me and my friends at lunch starting tomorrow, because nobody should have to eat alone unless they want to. Morgan's eyes filled with tears of relief. Really? You do that? Really, Sable confirmed. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. If I can use what I learned to help someone else, then maybe all of it wasn't completely pointless. Over the next few weeks, Sable found herself becoming an informal advocate for other students dealing with harassment. Word spread that she was someone who would listen, who would believe you, who would actually take action. Principal Anderson learned to cringe when he saw her approaching his office, because it usually meant another documented incident he couldn't ignore. The atmosphere at Lincoln High continued to shift, slowly but noticeably, toward a culture where speaking up was safer than it had been before. Knox watched this transformation with obvious pride. "You're basically a superhero," he told her one night when they were parked at their favorite overlook, the lights of the town spread out below them. "Taking all that strength and using it to protect people instead of just protecting yourself." "I'm not a superhero," Sable protested. "I'm just doing what anyone should do." "But most people don't," Knox pointed out. "Most people stay silent because it's easier. You could have transferred schools, moved away, pretended Lincoln High didn't exist. Instead, you're here making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other people. That's heroic." Sable leaned into him, feeling his warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of his soap and the coffee they'd shared earlier. "I couldn't have done it without you." "When everyone else saw me as either a victim or a threat, you saw me as a person. That made all the difference." "You made it easy," Knox said, kissing the top of her head. "You're pretty remarkable, Sable Thorne. I knew it the first day I saw you in the library, even though you were trying so hard to be invisible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge as the sky darkened. Sable thought about the journey that had brought her here, from Portland's underground circuits to her grandmother's hospital room, from that first day at Lincoln High, feeling hunted and alone, to now, surrounded by friends and purpose and a relationship that felt like solid ground beneath her feet. She thought about the promise she'd made and how she'd both kept it and broken it. She hadn't become the person who fought for money and adrenaline, who measured her worth in wins and losses, but she hadn't become completely passive either, hadn't eliminated the parts of herself that were strong and skilled and capable of protection. She'd found something in between, a way to be powerful without being destructive, to stand up for herself and others without losing her humanity. The spring semester brought changes throughout Lincoln High. New anti-bullying protocols were implemented, actually enforced this time, with anonymous reporting systems and mandatory consequences. Several teachers who'd been repeatedly reported for ignoring harassment were quietly reassigned. A student-led peer mediation program was established, giving students more agency in resolving conflicts before they escalated. Sable was asked to speak at a school assembly about her experience. She almost declined, uncomfortable with the attention and the assumption that her story was somehow inspirational. But Morgan convinced her, arguing that visibility mattered, that other students needed to hear from someone who'd survived and come out stronger. Standing at the podium in the auditorium in front of nearly 800 students, Sable felt her heart racing. She could handle physical threats with ease, but public speaking was a different kind of terror. Knox gave her an encouraging smile from the front row, and she took a breath. "I'm not going to tell you that what happened to me was okay," she began. "It wasn't. Being targeted, harassed, and physically threatened for months damaged me in ways I'm still working through. But I am going to tell you what I learned." She spoke for 15 minutes. her initial nervousness fading as she fell into the rhythm of her words. She talked about the difference between strength and aggression, about how staying silent made you complicit in others' cruelty, about how showing mercy was harder and braver than seeking revenge. She talked about the adults who failed her and the ones who finally stepped up. She talked about the importance of having even one person who believed you, who stood beside you when everyone else looked away. "I spent months being afraid," she said toward the end, "afraid of fighting back because I thought it made me like them. Afraid of showing who I really was because I thought people would reject me. Afraid that standing up for myself meant breaking a promise to someone I loved. But I learned that you can be strong without being cruel. You can defend yourself without becoming an aggressor. And you can honor the people you've lost by becoming someone they'd be proud of, even if that doesn't look exactly like what they imagined." The applause when she finished was thunderous, sustained, and as Sable walked back to her seat, multiple students stopped her to shake her hand or thank her for speaking. Teachers she'd never talked to told her how moved they were. Principal Anderson, to his credit, acknowledged publicly that the administration had failed her and committed to doing better. In March, Sable received a letter from a scholarship foundation specifically for students who'd overcome significant adversity. Knox had nominated her, writing an essay about her character and resilience that made Sable cry when he finally showed it to her. She won the scholarship, a substantial award that would cover most of her college expenses, and came with a mentorship program pairing her with professionals in her field of interest. Her relationship with Knox continued to deepen in ways that felt natural and right. They had their disagreements and difficult conversations, moments of insecurity and misunderstanding, but they worked through them with the kind of honest communication that Sable had never experienced before. Knox met every part of her with acceptance, the fighter from Portland, the grieving granddaughter, the student trying to figure out who she wanted to become. He never asked her to be anyone other than herself. One April evening, they were helping his dad work on a particularly challenging engine rebuild when Knox's father said something that stopped Sable in her tracks. "You're good for my son," Mr. Barrett said, wiping grease from his hands. "I haven't seen him this settled in years." "Whatever you two have, it's the real thing." Sable wasn't sure how to respond to that level of approval, so she just smiled and went back to the work at hand. But later, when she and Knox were alone, she brought it up. "Your dad thinks we're the real thing," she said. Knox didn't hesitate. "He's right, aren't we?" "Yeah," Sable agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "Yeah, we are." The end of the school year approached with the usual chaos of exams and applications and decisions about the future. Sable had been accepted to several colleges, all with generous financial aid packages thanks to her grades, her scholarship, and what college admissions officers apparently considered a compelling personal narrative. She and Knox had decided to attend universities in the same state, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have their own experiences and growth. On the last day of school, Sable walked through the now familiar hallways of Lincoln High with a sense of closure. So much had happened within these walls: trauma and triumph, fear and friendship, the gradual transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. She'd arrived at this school trying to hide who she was, and she was leaving knowing exactly who she was and being okay with that complexity. She met Knox at their usual spot by her locker. They'd carved their initials into the underside of one of the lockers months ago, a small act of defiance and permanence that had felt significant at the time and felt even more so now. "Ready to get out of here?" Knox asked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "More than ready," Sable confirmed. They walked toward the exit, passing the cafeteria where the infamous hot sauce incident had occurred, passing the library where they'd first talked, passing all the locations that had become markers in their shared story. Students they knew called out goodbyes and well wishes. Teachers waved. The school that had once felt like a prison now felt like just a building, neutral space that held memories but no longer held power over her. At the door, Sable paused and looked back one last time. Across the hallway, she saw a younger student being shoulder-checked by someone bigger. The smaller student stumbled but kept walking, head down, trying to be invisible. Sable caught their eye and gave them a slight nod. Acknowledgement, solidarity, a silent message that they weren't alone, even though it might feel that way. The student straightened slightly, their shoulders squaring, and continued walking with something that might have been confidence beginning to form. "You okay?" Knox asked, noticing her pause. "Yeah," Sable said, turning back toward the exit, toward the future waiting beyond Lincoln High's walls. "I'm good. Let's go." They stepped out into bright May sunshine, into warmth and possibility, into whatever came next. Sable had learned that strength wasn't about dominating others or winning fights. Real strength was in restraint, in standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, in showing mercy while maintaining boundaries, in refusing to let cruelty make you cruel. She'd kept her promise to her grandmother in the ways that mattered. She hadn't become someone who used violence casually or sought it out for thrills, but she'd also learned that there was a difference between violence and protection, between aggression and defense. Her grandmother hadn't wanted her to become weak. She'd wanted her to become wise. And wisdom, Sable now understood, was knowing when to fight, when to walk away, and when simple presence and refusal to back down was enough to change everything. As she and Knox walked toward his car, hands linked, Sable felt the weight of the past year beginning to lift. The trauma would take time to fully process. The scars would fade, but never completely disappear. But she'd survived with her humanity intact. More than survived, she'd transformed pain into purpose, strength into service, fear into fuel for becoming someone her grandmother would be proud of. Someone called her name from across the parking lot. Morgan and a few other students she'd helped over the past months, waving goodbye. Sable waved back, feeling the ripple effect of her choices spreading outward, touching lives she might never fully know about. Knox squeezed her hand. "You changed this place, you know. Made it better, just by refusing to let them break you." "We changed it," Sable corrected. "None of this would have worked if I'd been alone." "True," Knox acknowledged, "but you were the one who showed everyone that it was possible to stand up without losing yourself. That's going to matter for a long time after we're gone." They drove away from Lincoln High as the bell rang one final time, marking the end of classes, the beginning of summer, the close of a chapter that had tested Sable in ways she could never have anticipated. She'd come to Illinois trying to escape who she was, and instead she'd learned to integrate all the parts of herself, the fighter, the student, the friend, the advocate, the girl who'd made a promise, and the young woman who'd learned that keeping promises sometimes meant redefining them. The road ahead was uncertain, but no longer frightening. Sable had faced her fears, had stood up when it mattered, had chosen mercy over vengeance, and still emerged victorious. Whatever challenges came next, and there would be challenges, life guaranteed that, she knew she could handle them. Not by eliminating the parts of herself that were strong and capable of protection, but by using those parts wisely, with compassion, in service of something larger than personal victory. As they drove toward the overlook one last time, toward the sunset and the summer and the future waiting beyond it, Sable understood that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the promise she'd extracted in that hospital room. It had been the faith that Sable could be strong without being destructive, powerful without being cruel, capable of both incredible force and incredible mercy. That she could be both the fighter and the peacemaker, both the protector and the protected, both the person who could break someone and the person who chose not to. True strength, she'd learned, was having the power to destroy and choosing instead to build, having the ability to hurt and choosing instead to heal, having every reason for revenge and choosing instead to model a better way forward. The hot sauce had been instant karma, yes. A moment where Tatum's cruelty had quite literally blown up in his face. But the real karma, the lasting impact, came from what Sable chose to do afterward. Not escalation, not dominance, not becoming what she'd fought against. Just steady presence, clear boundaries, and the courage to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. That was the lesson worth keeping, the promise worth honoring, the strength worth cultivating. And as the sun set over Illinois farmland, and Knox hummed along to the radio, and Sable felt genuinely at peace for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she knew that her grandmother would understand, would approve, would be proud of the woman Sable was becoming. The girl from Portland who'd fought in underground rings was part of her. The quiet new student who'd tried to disappear was part of her. The advocate who'd found her voice was part of her. And all those parts together, integrated and whole, made her someone capable of not just surviving the world, but actually making it a little bit better. That was enough. That was everything. That was the person she'd keep becoming, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of choosing mercy over vengeance at a time. The story that had started with a promise and a death and a desperate attempt to become someone different was ending with acceptance and life, and the understanding that she'd been strong enough all along. She just needed to learn how to use that strength in ways that built instead of destroyed, that protected instead of punished, that honored both the dead and the living by becoming someone worthy of their faith. Sable Thorne had learned to be silent when necessary and loud when it mattered, to be strong without being cruel, to fight without losing herself. And in learning those lessons, in living through those impossible months at Lincoln High, she'd become exactly the person her grandmother had hoped for. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole and wise and ready for whatever came next.